Good evening. I would like to thank KSU for organizing this event with such a varied lineup of speakers. Also, KSU holds quite a special place in my heart, as 20 years ago I was on the board, the only woman out of a board of 11. Things seems to have really changed. Besides those years being some of the best and more formative of my life, personally, it was also a time of immense change for Malta. We were so proud to be the first Maltese Erasmus generation, the first students who could enjoy free movement across the continent. Of course, maybe being 20 helped. However, it was a time of great hope and excitement for Malta to be entering a new era as a member state of the European Union. Fast forward 20 years or so, and Malta is possibly facing the biggest constitutional crisis since independence. In 2017, we saw the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, followed in 2019 by weeks of large national protests, spurred on not by political parties, but by civil society. At the core of these protests, not a political endgame, but a call for justice, and a shocking public realization that something deep and visceral was wrong in our young democracy. In the background, you can see images and videos sent to us at Aditus Foundation by people who were there at the protests in the streets as part of a project aimed at preserving the collective memory of those days. This collective memory, this history, reminds us that although there may be a sense that things are stuck, there is also hope that positive change will and has happened. Neglect and complacency and corruption had embedded itself so deeply that we saw the gradual but steady erosion of the rule of law in Malta, which led to a brave journalist, Daphne, paying the ultimate price. We've heard so much about the rule of law, but what is it? These words, they sound so academic and theoretical. However, in reality, it is a simple and practical concept. The term rule of law comprises a set of principles which dictate that no one, including governments, politicians, or lawmakers, is above the law. This broadly translates into 4 guiding principles. The first principle is accountability, that government and its institutions are not given any preferential treatment because they are in a position of power. The second principle is that laws must be just. It sounds obvious, but it means that laws need to be understandable, they need to be accessible, which means they need to be public, and we need to know about them, and they need to be applied equally and not more or less strictly to some people. Thirdly, the government should be open. It should be transparent when drafting laws and when enforcing them. Lastly, but no less important, is that justice should be accessible and impartial. This means that those that enforce the law should be independent, adequately qualified, and there should be a separation of power between these people, so the judiciary, and those that hold political power. And it is this last principle that I would like to focus on. So the backbone of ensuring the rule of law is justice. Justice that is transparent, effective, and accountable. Justice that guarantees that individuals residing in Malta, including the most vulnerable in society, are ensured equality before the law, in the protection, but also in the guarantee of their rights. This principle of equality means that every person, irrespective of political allegiance, financial status, immigration status, is treated equally before the law. In practice, this means that every person should be treated fairly and equally in the way that laws apply to them, that they have equal access to the courts and legal representation, even if they can't afford it. Again, this might sound a bit too idealistic or academic, that the call for equal justice is far removed from our nitty-gritty of our day-to-day life. However, it is exactly the opposite. These exact principles, or the absence of them, in practice, affect each and every one of us in our daily lives. And I'll kind of give you some examples. Who appoints the members who sit on the Environmental and Planning Review Tribunal that decides applications that could have an effect on your quality of life or on the green areas that you enjoy with your family? Who sits on the Information and Data Protection Tribunal, and who appoints them? This tribunal decides on who has the right to access information, on your right to know, and on whether your data protection has been breached. Who sits and decides on whether an individual should be kept in detention without any criminal charge at the Immigration Appeals Board? And who are those people who sit on the International Protection Appeals Tribunal, who decide whether the rejection of an asylum seeker coming from Ukraine, say, or Syria, is right or wrong? Well, these people, mostly lawyers, but also other people who have knowledge in the area, are directly appointed by either the minister or the prime minister, depending on the particular act that created these tribunals. So there's no public appointment, no public call, no independent or peer review committee that scrutinizes the applications to ensure independence and qualifications. There are people who may, very well, and some do, work in the same field in their private practice. Again, these quasi-judicial boards and tribunals are not under the umbrella of the Commission of the Administration of Justice. Does this sound particularly impartial or independent? So therefore, your right to information, the right to hold the administration accountable by asking for such information, the right to liberty, the right to be protected from torture, the right not to be returned to a place where there could be a risk of harm, are decided upon by people directly appointed by politicians that have a political agenda. For a more concrete example, in 2021, the International Protection Appeals Tribunal rejected all 477 appeals filed in front of them, except for 4, which belonged to a family of 4, which it did not really overturn, but it sent back for reassessment. This means that there were 0 appeals that were won by any asylum seekers. It would be lovely to think that it was because the protection agency is 100% right 100% all of the time, but we couldn't know that because their decisions are not public or published. So, moving on, if an individual feels that their rights have been breached by the state, they would then would find themselves having to fight tooth and nail to reach the courts. For the most vulnerable, this could be because of lack of information, a lack of knowledge of the laws, a lack of access to lawyers, and also a lack of financial resources. And once they reach our civil and constitutional courts, they then have to contend with a lack of resources, also bemoaned by the judiciary, an archaic system that hasn't caught up with the 21st century digitalization process, lengthy court proceedings, and for some, the impossibility of accessing legal aid. Our own constitutional court was famously criticized by a local judge, a former judge of the European Court of Human Rights, Justice Giovanni Bonello, that found that 85% of the judgments of our constitutional court that reached Strasbourg had been found to be human rights garbage by the Strasbourg chambers and were overturned. In his book, Misunderstanding the Constitution, he controversially explained how, in his opinion, the Maltese judiciary undermines human rights by being subservient to the human rights perpetrator, the government, as opposed to the victim. In a similar vein, another former Strasbourg judge, Justice Vincent de Gaetano, had stated that it is much easier to obstruct justice surreptitiously and not in violation of the law by appointing incompetent or politically subservient people to certain posts. And most importantly, it is the most vulnerable that are disproportionately affected by injustice. Victims of domestic violence, sex workers, children, exploited migrants, asylum seekers, and those without papers. Bernice and Sion, and the 28 other women who died at the hands of family members or partners since the year 2000. Miriam Patch and Jean-Paul Sophia, and the other victims of our insatiable construction industry. Lasana Sisse, who was shot simply for the fact of being black by 2 off-duty army officers. Mamadou Kamara, Nabil, and Ifayeni, who died in detention centers or at the back of detention vans. Rujin, a 4-year-old Syrian girl who died of thirst on a boat that was in our search and rescue area, and the over 2,400 dead or missing migrants that have attempted to cross the Mediterranean in 2022. It might bear reminding that these basic inalienable rights, those principles contained in the Maltese Constitution and the multitude of conventions we have signed, belong to everyone, rich, poor, regular, irregular, young, old, male, female, black, brown, or white. As I move towards my conclusions, I would like to just spend some time to remember those who are languishing in our detention centres. While some indeed may have breached immigration rules, they have not committed any crime. They are nonetheless detained and deprived of their liberty for months and months. Whilst Malta has the right to return people who do not face a risk of harm, this must be done speedily, in full respect of their rights, including their right to apply for asylum, to have a proper and fair procedure, and to be treated with dignity. Many spend months and months in detention, some to be released as required by law after 18 months, without ever being returned. 18 months detained in a place that was described as bordering on institutional neglect by the Council of Europe. 1 year and 6 months deprived of liberty, with barely a functioning telephone to phone their mum, their dad, to say that they survived the journey, or to call a lawyer if they even know of a lawyer. And finally, on the subject of justice and the importance of it being accessible, I would like to remember those that are purposely left out of the protection of our justice system. For example, migrants who are left out purposely and cynically outside our territorial waters on tourist ferry boats for over 2 months in the year 2020. No contact with the outside world, no contact with lawyers, no opportunity to ask for protection. During those difficult COVID days, when we were coming together, all of us as a community, yet treating over 300 people with such a lack of respect for human dignity. I would like to remember also those migrants whose only hope of protection is to cross one of the deadliest migration routes in the world, for lack of any other legal pathways to travel to Europe. Calls for assistance in Malta's search and rescue zone go ignored and ignored for days, sometimes weeks, until it is too late. Malta, at times, does not even step up to coordinate, not even to conduct a rescue with a disembarkation in a closer, safer port, even if that port is not Maltese. Would we ignore these boats in distress if they were, say, Australian or American? I don't think so. And we have to ask ourselves, is that really equality before the law? How is it that Malta signs all these human rights and maritime treaties, but doesn't adhere to the obligations contained in them without any accountability? How is this justice? We seem to consider that justice is something incidental to our democracy and not really at the very heart of it. I know it might sound quite bleak for a Friday night. However, if I could just steal a few words from Dr. King and say that only when it was dark enough can we see the stars. And if I may add, continue to hope. Hope as an act of defiance against those who try their utmost to preserve the status quo. Hope that pushed many into the streets in 2019. Hope that is not naive, but that recognizes that the future is unknown, and in this big unknown, with our actions, we can do something. Thank you.